Will we call it victory? We called it victory before. It's a very confusing notion because it is scrambling with our preconceptions and what we grew up believing, but it is something to really grapple with. But you kind of have to ask yourself, what kind of victory in the past replaced one totalitarian monster, meaning Hitler, of course, with a greater one, with a greater killing field, with a greater empire. I mean, this is kind of, and I started thinking World War II, the good war, moral clarity, black and white, all of that stuff, and you just think, how can we say that? What really went on? And when you see the Soviet strategy fulfilled, it becomes a different sight. After the Cold War, we claim victory, yet we have 100 million dead, according to the Black Book of Communism and Communist Regimes at the end of the 20th century. And today we have a Republican Congress that cannot vote to defund socialized medicine. So again, maybe the Cold War of our mind is what we lost. Everyone I'm sure here is very aware Congress doesn't consider a border important, can't even vote to defend it. Citizenship is cheap. We have the Constitution in tatters at this point. We have a president who absolutely acts unconstitutionally almost every time he makes a statement from the Rose Garden. But the world that emerges, no borders, citizenship in tatters, no constitution, socialized medicine, what we see, thank you, very sweet. What we see is a resemblance to a new world order a la Marxism Leninism. I mean, we have to start seeing these patterns and not just block them out. Then I found this comment from General Wiedemeyer in his 1958 memoir. He said, "The irony of it all is that the Soviet Empire is largely one of our own creation." And I think he was right, and I think that we can see a similar type of Soviet Empire of the mind took hold here through the penetration and the relationship of lies that we became very used to telling. This increasing complicity in Soviet crimes, the silence, turning away from them, silencing the truth tellers. This is the kind of thing I track case by case. And I think it really did something to us as a country. And remember that moral fall in 1933. I think it released our grasp on morality and reality. And I think the two go together. There's a book that I came across that I cite. It's a very good book, short book, that was written at the end of World War II by a very noted military correspondent who worked for the New York Times, Hanson Baldwin. And he wrote a book called Great Mistakes of the War. When I first got the book, again, early in my research, I was thinking, what mistakes? What mistakes could we possibly have made? And I read his book and found that these mistakes were not military mistakes. Listen to the first two. First great mistake of the war was that the Soviet Union had abandoned its policy of world revolution. Number two, that Uncle Joe Stalin was a good fellow. Uncle Joe Stalin was a good fellow, someone we could get along with. These are mental mistakes, they're propaganda mistakes, they're results of Office of War Information, which became one of the little agencies that sprang up during World War II, controlled information and wartime censorship. It was riddled with Soviet agents. I mean, when you compare the lists from Venona, from Soviet archives, from FBI archives, the names and the desks, I mean, it was absolute Red Star Central, and they were controlling our information. So where's the propaganda coming from? Do you say it's pro-Soviet, or is it just like Soviet? And I think, again, coming back to this notion of occupation. So the American people were learning about this stuff from, right from, Propaganda Central. That Uncle Joe was a Democrat, was someone we could get a small D Democrat, someone we could get along with. FDR actually declared that there was religious freedom in the Soviet Union during this period. And again, does this sound familiar? We hear the same things about Islam, about its compatibility with democracy. We hear about how we can get along and incorporate it, and these are the kinds of things. We hear that jihad is only personal struggle, ignoring the emphasis on
military conquest. And this is what we're really up against. And even the parallels go to the point where in the old days I'm finding references to fear of offending the Russians. Well, we all know about we're supposed to walk on eggs, fear of offending Muslims, fear of offending Islam. Same thing. We're doing the same thing again. And so these are sort of some of the, this is kind of the general notion of what I get at in a book that's over 400 pages and has 961 endnotes. And they are all there in very small type because my editor said, no one will believe you if we don't have all the endnotes. It's a long story, but I was on a very long interview show. In fact, I mentioned it to someone in the room earlier. It was actually, believe it or not, a 3-hour show about the book on an internet radio show. And at the end of the interview, I got an email from a man who'd listened to all 3 hours. And he wrote to me and he said, essentially, you are saying that all post-1930 American World War II and Cold War history as it has been presented is a fiction. So you're thinking, well, I wrote this book, it's 400 pages long, 961 footnotes. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's a very pithy way of saying it, but in the sense that is the essence. I'm trying to show how we were deceived, how hard it is to untell lies, and trying to understand where the pushback comes from. Again, from the left that cannot stand the unraveling of Roosevelt and the socialist state that he fostered. Let's face it, a socialist state that he fostered. We're not supposed to use that word. We weren't supposed to say it about President Obama when he ran for president in 2008. I had an experience, I was mentioned earlier, I was a CNN pundit, sorry, for a while, but I remember when, if you remember back in 2008, October, Joe the Plumber, everyone remember Joe the Plumber? He finally brought that whole concept to the fore, and of course the national media decided that what Americans needed to know was whether Joe the Plumber had a license. That was where they went. But I was sitting there with, he is a socialist. Yes, he is. And I wrote about it, and I wrote about his connections, and then there was some journalism, actually was a blogger in New Zealand, of all things, that broke the story that when President Obama actually became a politician, he was running on a Democratic New Party ticket. The New Party was a socialist party in Chicago. It was a fusion candidate, they called it, and there were pictures, PDFs of the actual listings where he's on both tickets. And I remember trying to bring this to CNN's attention, and they weren't very interested. But nonetheless, I had the opportunity at this time to go on the air, and I'd been writing this, but I hadn't said it on the air. And I'm sitting there in Washington. Usually I was in just a little remote studio by myself. Well, the show was produced in New York. And I was sitting there thinking, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say it. Why was I like that? Why was I so? Because you don't hear it, and you feel that it must not be true because no one else is talking about it. And so you're sitting there, and of course I hadn't had my inspiration of my truth tellers yet, so I was still working from just alone, really. And so, yes, indeed, my turn came, and it wasn't the greatest statement, frankly. Lou said something like, well, Diana, what do you think is going to happen in this election? And I said something like, well, American voters are going to have to decide whether they want to whether Senator Obama will take the country in a socialist direction. I said it. And the next guest opened his mouth. He was a Democratic strategist who worked for Hillary Clinton. And he said, Diana, red baiting went out a long time ago. And so, the conversation went around the table, and I was sitting there fuming in Washington, waiting to cut back at this. And when Lou Dobbs came back to me with some question, I have no idea what he said. I said, well, Lou, yes, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But first, and I went into a very long little speech about Barack Obama's perceived, clear socialist policies. But the point is, there is that kind of a press, against speaking out when you don't hear it. And so I think that this is one of the calls to action we're talking about in terms of bringing things to the forefront. The silence is death, and the guilt, the shared guilt, must be revealed. These are the kinds of developments that I would hope would stem from the information in this book. Stanton Evans, whom some of you may know, is a great American writer, historian, patriot, and I am very pleased that I consider him my mentor. He wrote a book called Blacklisted by History about Senator Joe McCarthy that essentially reconstructs the era with original documents and does indeed prove Senator McCarthy was correct in so much of what he did, what he could know at the time, and how he was utterly just transformed into a caricature of himself, which is what we live with today. But during my research, I ended up talking to Stanton Evans a few times. He was very generous with his time. And he once told me something so valuable. He said, when you come back to a document that you found, or a memoir, or a piece of information you found after an interim, it will always look different. It will always make more sense to you in a new way. And I found this very helpful advice. And I would just share with you how this worked. I read very early in my research, it was an anecdote by Vladimir Bukovsky, who was an ex-dissident from the Soviet Union. He was tortured in psychiatric hospitals and so on. And he, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin invited him into the archives to essentially assemble a trial, a case against communism, like the Nuremberg trials. And not to try people, because he said that would be about 19 million defendants, but the system. And he was copying archives and copying documents, which he took out with him, because of course the archive closed at a certain point. But what he said was, at a certain point, Yeltsin came to him and said, it's off, we're not gonna do this. I am getting such pressure not to try communism, not to try the system. He was getting pressure from the West. Yeltsin saw the cables, they were from the West, not to try communism, not to demonstrate what the Cold War had been about. And when I first read this, I did not understand. I mean, I believed him, but I just couldn't quite put it together a few years ago. But that's when, later on, at the end of this book, I understood that, again, the elites, the leaders, they don't want the truth. They want the phony narrative. And the narrative becomes more important to them than the truth, than the American people, certainly than the truth tellers. So manipulating us becomes really the ultimate American betrayal. And I would just close with a remark from Solzhenitsyn, who wrote in evident frustration. He wrote at one point, he said, "It is as if the West actually does not want to know the truth until the moment when this knowledge has ceased to be of use." It's a very staggering statement, and I certainly hope he's wrong. I'm very much hoping we can learn from these truths, and even when they do break our hearts, because some of this information is very heartbreaking, but it's very much of use to us. And we learn from this the deception that the US government is capable of, how false narratives are written, how lives are wasted, how truth tellers can be marginalized and forgotten. And this cannot go on. And I also hope very much that this kind of work, this exercise, shows us that it is happening again. We are living through it again. And I thank you for your very kind attention.